Bonjour and welcome. My name is Kelly Momsen, and I'm the chairperson of Howard Wooden Lecture Series. Since this event is in capacity, we're not going to be able to chat after this, so please just put your questions in the chat box, and Dr. Cook will respond to those later. Also, we have people from all over, and we were hoping that if you're out of state, please put that in the chat box. I'd be curious to see where everybody's from. So I would like to welcome you all now to, hopefully, the last virtual Howard Wooden Lecture. Before we get started, I'd like to give you a bit of history on how this series got started. In 1985, Howard E. Wooden was the director of the Wichita Art Museum. He suggested that the Friends of the Art Museum develop an endowment fund as part of the museum's 50th anniversary celebration. Beginning in 1997, the Friends started to establish 3 endowments. The first 2 were for exhibitions and acquisitions of art and the library fund. The third one was the Howard Wooden Lecture Series, and that was established in the year 2000. The purpose of this fund was funding of public lectures at the Art Museum. The main declaration was that all lectures had to be open to the public and free. The endowment started with $192,620 and are now just worth a little bit under $3 million. We have an exciting program tonight with Dr. Lindsay Cook, but first I would like to introduce our museum curator, Dr. Tara Hedrick, and then she will introduce our speaker. Dr. Hedrick has had an impressive career for being so young, and to mention a few things, teaching at WSU, Kansas State, KU, Binghamton University in New York, and serving as a curatorial intern at the Spencer Art Museum and the Art Institute of Chicago. Other work has taken her to Bulgaria, Turkey, Greece, and Israel. We are so grateful that Tara has decided to return to her hometown. Hey, Tara.
Thank you, Kelly, for that absolutely lovely introduction. And I want to apologize to everyone, including Lindsay, who I'm sure is poised and ready to go, bearing with us. Everything's going great on our end here at WAM, but Zoom is not allowing everyone to enter. So we're working on that, and hopefully people will only miss the introductions here. But for everyone that is here, cheers. Cheers. I hope you have your wine. I hope you have your cheese. And I also have to say that it was just a real delight to see everyone in the chat. Hi, we love you. All our friends, and can't wait for the day when we're all here back in person at WAM doing.
All right, it's great to see you.
Hi.
Great to see
so
you.
Tonight's event, as Kelly mentioned, is sponsored by the Friends of the Wichita Art Museum, WAM's beloved volunteer group that is the driving force behind so many of our events and programs. This distinguished annual lecture is held in honor of Howard Wooden, WAM's director from 1975 until 1989. Howard was before my time, but was responsible for so many things that we still enjoy today, such as the museum's expansion, which happened in 1977, and hundreds of artworks that he added to the collection. He lives on in memory as a great man and a great director and a great collector who charmed Wichita's museum goers. And these lectures are the way that WAM honors his memory. So I have to say that I'm so excited that so many of you are here to learn from and experience Dr. Lindsay Cook. I had a preview of her talk last night and it was spectacular. So you are all going to love it. Dr. Cook is an expert on French Gothic architecture and has her BA from Vassar College and her MA and PhDs from Columbia University, where she wrote her dissertation that explored the architectural influence of Paris's Notre Dame Cathedral Cathedral on other Gothic churches built in the region. Indeed, Lindsay's whole resume is a testament to her passion for all things French, architectural, and medieval. Before entering the PhD program at Columbia in 2011, Lindsay served as a panorama photographer for the Mapping Gothic France project. She's contributed to numerous other digital humanities projects, including the interactive website Life of a Cathedral, Notre Dame of Amiens. In 2019, Dr. Cook led Columbia University's Paris Study Abroad program, and I've already told her that I'm ready for her to take all of us on study abroad once coronavirus is over and we can all travel again. And after finishing 2 years as a visiting professor at Vassar College, Lindsay is the brand new assistant professor of art history at Ball State University. She is here tonight to tell us about the late Dr. Andrew Tallon's digital scanning project of Notre Dame and its impact on ongoing restoration projects. Dr. Cook translated Dr. Tallon's book, Notre Dame Cathedral, 9 Centuries of History, into English. So, cheers to Lindsay, cheers to all of you, and let's welcome Lindsay virtually to Wichita.
Thank you so much, Tara. And I'm going to go ahead and straight away share my screen so that we can make sure that's working. So I take it you're all able to see my screen now, I hope. Yes? Can I get, okay, wonderful. So good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for being here. I really am so touched. And I want to thank Tara again for inviting me and everyone at WHAM for organizing this event, and especially the friends who I know are really behind this lecture series. Well, I'm really disappointed to miss out on seeing you all in Wichita. I was really looking forward to this event in the spring. And I was especially looking forward to answering your questions at the end of my talk and speaking with you one-on-one. But I'm nevertheless really delighted to be here virtually with you. And I again invite you to submit your questions through the chat, and I would be happy to answer them at the end of my talk. As you know, tonight I'll be discussing Notre Dame of Paris. And over the past decade, this building has really become the focus of my scholarly research. But I have to say to you all tonight, because I think we might share this in common, that I've loved this building since childhood, and I have incredibly fond memories of visiting Notre Dame over the years. So this is also a sort of labor of love, and that's part of why I'm here tonight. I'm really touched, as I said before, that you're all here. A year and a half has elapsed since a catastrophic fire damaged Notre Dame of Paris, throwing its custodians and admirers like us for a loop and leaving the building in a fragile and fragmentary state without a roof or steeple. The fire made the restoration campaign already underway far more complex and exponentially more expensive. Yet it also set off a wave of philanthropic giving, which the project had previously struggled to attract. And we can talk a bit about this at the end if you're interested in hearing some of the backstory behind the restoration already underway as of 2019. About a decade before the fire, in 2010, with the financial backing of the producers of a documentary, eventually broadcast on the European arts and culture television station Arte, as Cathedrals Unveiled, that's the English translation of the title, the late architectural historian Andrew Tallon, who was also my undergraduate mentor, produced a full laser scan of Notre Dame of Paris from pavement to spire. The process began by placing a series of reflective targets on the surface of the building. Then, from there, once these targets had been placed around the site, a state-of-the-art laser scanner was then placed in dozens of spots throughout the building to capture every inch, and actually really every millimeter. In another documentary, the PBS Nova special, Building the Great Cathedrals, Andrew Tallon himself explained what came next in the laser scanning process in his characteristic way, which blends technical language. He was had a background in math and physics, but also a heavy dose of Midwestern charm, which I say very much with love as a Midwesterner myself. He described the process like this, quote, "The laser scanner sends out a little laser beam from its eye, and it measures 1,000 times a second the distance between itself, the laser scanner, and whatever it's hitting. And so as it slowly pans across the wall, it's shooting this laser out and taking a whole series of measurements, end quote. So laser scanning is an efficient means of measuring an entire building, and it results in a mass of data known as a point cloud. So the idea of measuring buildings is a very old notion, and it's something that architectural historians used to have to do with measuring tapes, just as simple as that, and they would survey the entire building. So this is a way to do this entire process in even more detail and much quicker than you used to be able to in the past. So that data set, the point cloud, can then be sliced into smaller pieces and examined more closely using analytical computer software. While this data from the Notre Dame laser scans has become a precious record of Notre Dame, digitally preserving the cathedral in its pre-fire state, Tallon's own reasons for employing this particular technology were decidedly different. The primary reason he wanted a laser scan of Notre Dame of Paris was to understand Gothic structure more fully and to pinpoint structural anomalies in the building's design. So I'm showing you in this image, you're seeing a slice from the choir of the cathedral that's taken from the laser scan. So for those of you, I saw that there were some architects on the call. So for those of you who are familiar with various modes of architectural representation, you're able to make those kinds of renderings based on this data, which is a really useful tool. So to cite just one example of these structural anomaly or reasons that Andrew Tallon was interested in producing this laser scan, the scan served as the basis for a new ground plan of the cathedral. What would be fair to call the first accurate plan of the building. For generations, plans of Notre Dame, which were published in the literature, were straightened to appear more geometrically regular than the building actually is. In reality, the cathedral's ground plan is far more idiosyncratic, as we'll see in a moment. So here we see two slices from the laser scan, two plans rendered from the laser scan at different heights, different levels. And these two were fused together to draft the new ground plan. So I'm now going to show you the resulting plan, which was taken from this data. So you see here the ground plan and also the colors indicate the various phases of construction of the cathedral. Nowhere is the cathedral's irregularity more visible in the resulting ground plan than in the nave piers. So this part of the building is the nave, and the piers are these circles, which you see here. And I invite you to select one of these dark blue circles that you see here in the nave and use your imagination to project a line from one of these circles across the nave, and imagine that it's a completely straight line. Does your imaginary line hit the center of the blue circle at the opposite end of the nave? I'll give you a second. It doesn't really, right? And as you see, each pier of the south side of the nave is positioned slightly to the right or eastward of the corresponding pier on the north side of the nave. So this pier, for example, is east of this pier. Even more remarkable than these irregularities, which are very fun to notice, once you see one of them, you can find others in the building. Almost more remarkable than that, though, is almost the perfect regularity of the analogous piers in the choir. So if you look at the choir and did the same exercise, you would find that it's much straighter across the nave. The 3D laser scan may have mapped these idiosyncrasies more accurately than ever before, but they are actually the kinds of anomalies that are visible inside the building with the naked eye. So if you were to stand in the central vessel of Notre Dame with your back against a pier and look straight ahead across the width of the nave, you would see not the center of another pier, as you would expect, but instead you would see a void. And this is, again, something that's a kind of fun party trick. Once you know about this, you can amaze your friends by showing this off next time you're at Notre Dame. The new plan and some of Andrew Tallon's other findings were published in the 2013 book he co-authored with Sorbonne University professor and researcher Dany Sandron. And a new, slightly revised French edition of this book was published mere days after the 2019 fire. Because it had been published a few years before, there was new demand, of course, after the fire, and so a new edition was published in France. And while living and teaching in Paris in the summer of 2019, I translated the 2019 edition of the original French language text into English. And Penn State University Press recently published my translation under the title Notre Dame Cathedral, 9 Centuries of History. So this is available, and I encourage you, if you're interested in Notre Dame, take a look. You'll find everything I'm talking about tonight and more in this book. Above all, the laser scan effectively captured what was there when the scan was made in 2010. But it also served as the basis for a series of hypothetical reconstructions of historical states of the cathedral. The graphic designer Laurent Stéphano rendered the hypothetical reconstructions, layering appropriate textures on top of the laser scan data. So you saw the point cloud already, and you know that it has these sort of wild and wacky colors to it. And so what the graphic designer did was to overlay textures which are more naturalistic. As accurate as the measurements of the underlying models that we're seeing here are, these reconstructions also reflect specific scholarly points of view. So because we're talking about historical states of the building and not the state of the building that it was in 2010, it means that there are some conjectures made and speculations made here. Crucially, these models also show change over time. So I'm going to show you very quickly a few of these historical reconstructions, just to give you a sense of the way the building changed over time and took shape. So you see, for example, in this hypothetical reconstruction from around the year 1177, representing the year around then, what we see, and this is all these dates which seem very specific, those are based on specific texts that give us some sense of where the construction was at these various dates. So here, for example, one thing that's very important to notice for what I'm about to say later on in the talk is to see that at this point, there is a roof on the building, a wooden roof, covered with lead on either side, so a sloping, 2 sloping roofs. But you'll also notice that there is not yet any limestone vaults built underneath. So at this point, and this is of course hypothetical, but you see that the roof is already there to keep the elements out. And then there is formwork placed here in the cathedral on scaffolding, and that's where the stones will be placed on top of those to build the vaults. So this is showing a point before we even have limestone vaults. This is important to remember because this means that the limestone vaults are really independent of the wooden roof. These are 2 separate entities, and this comes into play when we talk about the fire and its impact on the building structure. Here you see additional states of the building, and you can see over time the construction essentially took place from east to west. By about 1245, there's a reference to bells in the bell towers by that date, and so for that reason, it's understandable that the bell towers would need to be in place for bells to be ringing within them. And by that point, as you can see, I think, the overall shape of the building looks very much like the building we would recognize. However, in its details, there are still major changes that take place in the 13th and 14th centuries in particular. So things like the rose window, the great roses of Notre Dame, these are from the middle of the 13th century. So you can see that there was a different kind of rose window. This is completely hypothetical, what you're seeing here. It's actually copied from another building, an abbey church. And because what you're more familiar with is this rose window that you see here. So that was added later on. But the broad strokes of the building were in place by the middle of the 13th century. Major changes were also made in the 19th century, particularly during the mid-century restoration by the architects Lassus and Viollet-le-Duc. And so you're seeing here a kind of before and after from this restoration campaign in the mid-19th century. Something that's notable about the daguerreotype you see at left is to notice all of the elements of the building we now associate with Notre Dame, the Notre Dame that was at risk after the fire. So many of those beloved aspects or iconic aspects of the building are not there in the daguerreotype from around 1840. We notice there are no kings placed in these niches here. Those had been removed after the French Revolution. There are no gargoyles because those were added in the 19th century, other features like that. You'll also notice that there's no spire on this version of the cathedral, which is something we'll come back to later on. So in this 19th century restoration, kings were added, sculpted and added to these niches. The gargoyles were added to the balustrade, and a spire was also designed for this cathedral. This project also, as I've mentioned, included the addition of the iconic pseudo-gargoyles to the balustrade, sculpted by Victor Pianet to Viollet-le-Duc's designs. And that 19th century restoration resulted in the version of the building you see here in a photograph I took from the Ile Saint-Louis a few years ago. This is probably the iteration of the building you have in mind when you think of Notre Dame. It certainly is the version of the building I think of when I think of the cathedral that was damaged in the 2019 fire. By 2019, a nonprofit had raised enough money for a major restoration project to get underway, really the largest restoration since the 19th century restoration. And they planned to begin with the spire. As we know, this spire was added to the building in the 19th century. It was designed by the man you see here at right, named Viollet-le-Duc. And actually, this is a statue of the Apostle Thomas, patron saint of architects, with the features of Viollet-le-Duc. So you see him up here. He's the only apostle who's not facing outward around the, looking out to the panorama of Paris. Instead, he's looking up toward his creation, the spire that he designed. In the image at left, we find similar statues that surround the base of the spire. These particular statues represent 3 apostles, so the standing figures, and a sort of kneeling or crouching evangelist symbol. In the spring of 2019, the restoration of the spire began. First with the construction of scaffolding, steel scaffolding around the base of the spire, and then in early April 2019, with the temporary removal of the copper statues of the apostles and evangelists from the base of the spire. So here you see this remarkable scene of a crane removing one of these figures. And this was quite a spectacle, and it was covered in all of the newspapers. And this seemed to be part of the reason they began this restoration project with the spire, was honestly to create this kind of spectacle that would attract additional funds to the restoration project. So that's part of the reason they began with this, this aspect of the building. The statues at that point were safely removed and transported to a warehouse to undergo a conservation treatment. And actually this has already been completed for a few of the statues, and in fact 3 of them are now on view in a museum in Paris, although I imagine now it will be closed during the new series of lockdowns for the next month. On April 15th, 2019, as of course we all know, the cathedral caught fire, less than a week after the copper statues had been taken down from the base of the spire. Steel scaffolding, as I mentioned, had been constructed around the spire to facilitate the restoration, and it was on that construction site that the fire broke out in the cathedral's wooden roof framework. The fire melted the spire's lead covering and its timber framework. So you see this taking place in this photograph. Eventually leading the tip of the spire to break off and crash through some of the stone vaults below. This photograph documents a key moment in the progression of the fire. Until this point, although the fire had spread unimpeded through the wooden roof, damaging the wooden roof, certainly destroying the wooden roof. At that point, the flames had still not yet licked the interior of the building, because remember, as we saw in the hypothetical reconstruction, the stone vaults still stood as a protective barrier. It was the collapse of the spire then, crashing through the limestone vaults, that really jeopardized the structural stability of the building and also damaged the interior, let lead flow into the interior, timbers from the roof. All of that only happened after the spire crashed through the crossing. Here we have a more distant view of the cathedral in a photograph taken after the spire had fallen and the roof structure had collapsed. What we're left with above the roof line then are the 3 stone gables that once capped the wooden roof. We have one at the north end, which you can see here, surrounded by 2 pinnacles, one at the south end over here, and the one at the west end of the cathedral, which is illuminated, as you can see, by the fire itself. This triangle here, that's the gable. So these used to cover up the wooden roof, and now they're exposed and really left more fragile than they ever would have been in the first place. So for example, in this side-by-side view, you see what the north transept gable looked like before and after the fire. So at left, you see a rendering from the laser scan. And at this point, right, the roof was still behind it. And then you have a photograph of the after image here with no roof left and the charred limestone of the gable. Really, this is one of the most horrific photographs, I think. With the smoldering cathedral as a backdrop, French President Emmanuel Macron delivered a short speech on the night of the fire. "We will rebuild this cathedral together," he assured listeners. In a separate address the next day, he specified that the building would be rebuilt better than ever within 5 years, by the year 2024. Appointed to oversee the project was Jean-Louis Georgelin, who now presides over a body known as the Établissement Public Chargé de la Conservation et de la Restauration de Notre Dame de Paris. So this is the organization responsible for overseeing this restoration project. At the conclusion of a cabinet meeting convened 2 days after the fire, then Prime Minister Édouard Philippe unveiled the administration's controversial plan to hold an international architectural competition to determine whether the spire should be rebuilt at all, and if so, whether it should be a copy of the one designed by the 19th century restoration architect, or if it should instead take the form of what he called, quote, "a new spire that reflects the techniques and issues of our own day." And I would love to talk with you at the end about what exactly was meant by that, because it's a very interesting formulation, this particular text, not only to do with materials, but probably also to do with French society of today. After months of debate, the administration ultimately approved the long-standing architect-in-chief Philippe Villeneuve's proposal to restore the 19th century spire, but not without a lot of controversy, some of which I'll talk about in a few moments. After the fire was extinguished, this was more or less the state of the building. Here you see the debris of the wooden roof, which is piled up, loading the tops of the thin limestone vaults. You can also observe the snarled steel of the restoration scaffolding, as well as the void in the midst of the scaffolding, where the roof and the spire previously stood. So we can see here the wood, which has fallen from the roof. These timbers have been charred and are left loading the vaults down below. We see, I was mentioning the scaffolding. We see here in particular, it's really melted down and is a bit of a mess over here. And then again, of course, this void right in the middle where the spire was previously placed. To my mind, though, there is much to say there's much that's eerie about this photograph. But to my mind, the clearest sign that something is wrong here is that from this vantage point outside, where usually when you look at a rose window, you would be seeing the glass would be darkened. From here, even though we're outside, we can see the light shining through in the colorful glass of this rose window. So to me, that's part of what makes this image, as horrible as it is, also very beautiful in its own way. A law passed in the summer of 2019 stipulates that the 21st century restoration or conservation and restoration of Notre Dame must, quote, preserve the historical, artistic, and architectural interest of the monument. For the past 18 months, Architect-in-Chief Philippe Villeneuve and his team have been doing exactly that. They were on the scene the night of the fire, and their efforts to shore up the building began shortly thereafter. First, they installed a temporary roof to protect the exposed stone vaults from the elements. So you see that temporary roof here, which really looks like a tent almost, placed, a sort of structured tent placed over the cornice. They also had wooden braces custom made to cradle the flying buttresses. And so you can see at this point, only the ones of the choir or the chevet have been added, and you can see them here. And each one is tailor-made to the particular flying buttress that it cradles. While the stained glass was not damaged, as we saw, the rose window, for example, was still completely intact, and most of it even remains in place. So for instance, the rose windows, they're still there, the glass. Workers have temporarily removed the glass from the upper windows. So you can see here the clear story tracery, the windows here. Of course, the stone tracery is still there, but the stained glass of these clear story windows have been removed. And this has most to do with the fact that this is a zone that it was in jeopardy. They were worried about the structure, especially of the vaults in the choir. And so if those had collapsed, let's say, they wouldn't have wanted to lead to any, the damage of any glass. It's also facilitating conservation of the glass while they've been removed. The architects subsequently designed a sturdier provisional roof, wooden roof. And so you see that wooden roof here covering the building. Not only does this temporary wooden roof protect the vaults below, but it also serves another rather ingenious function. Namely, to allow specially trained rope technicians to rappel from the newly built rafters down into the holes in the stone vault below, which was caused by the collapse of the spire. And the goal here is to ensure the stability of the vaults. So they would prefer to take out pieces of limestone that look like they might fall before they actually crash to the ground as people are working on the building. A lot of work along these lines has already been done, and the vaults are being monitored continuously to avoid further collapse. So if ever there's a windstorm or anything like that that shakes the steel scaffolding that's still in place, then an alarm goes off and everyone clears away from the site to avoid any hazardous conditions for the workers. If you're interested, these two stills are from a documentary. It was originally broadcast on France 2 in France under the title Sauver Notre Dame. And it was also broadcast in the United States under the title Saving Notre Dame on the National Geographic Channel. Two cranes have also subsequently been installed on either side of the cathedral. Stationed on the north flank, the smaller crane, which you see over here, its job is to lift pallets that contain meticulously documented archaeological remains out of the building before they're shuttled to tents, which you can see here pitched on the plaza in front of the cathedral. And so what is happening there is that as some of the cataloging effort is actually taking place inside the building, any remains of the roof, of the vaults, all of that is photographed meticulously, and only then is it taken out of the building. And then it's currently being stored mostly in these tents outside of the cathedral. Set up on the south flank of the cathedral, the larger crane, which you see here, prominent as it is, the larger crane facilitates the disassembly of the steel scaffolding, which had been put up to restore the spire prior to its collapse. So you can't quite see that aspect, but I'll show you now what the scaffolding looked like, at least as of 2019. So just to remind you, This is one of the really more difficult tasks. You can imagine for the contractor who was responsible for assembling this scaffolding, it's usually fairly straightforward to then disassemble your scaffolding at the end of a job. But here, now that it's caught fire and been involved in this entire debacle, it's a much, much more difficult task that he's now faced with. So just to review, because I know it's complicated and there's a lot going on here, the elements destroyed in the 2019 fire were the lead roof, so that melted, you'll recall, and this also led to some concerns about pollution around the site. The elaborate, sophisticated 13th century wooden roof framework, so that we saw the charred remains of the wooden roof littering the vaults. The 19th century spire, which was composed of a wooden core and a lead covering. The stone crossing vault, and some cells of the stone vaults, the limestone vaults of the transept. So in light of all of these losses, the digital record, which I showed you at the beginning of the cathedral in the form of the 3D laser scan, has become a precious point of reference for the conservators and restorers. Andrew Tallon's 2010 laser scan is now part of the composite model stitched together by a working group of the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris, or CNRS for short. And so I'm showing you here just to remind you, this is what the laser scan from 2010 looked like. And I'm now going to shift to an image of the composite scan. And just, you'll see that this really does form the core of the image I'm about to show you, but it does not, but the finished product is denser and more sort of filled out. So I'll show you now the composite scan. The CNRS has made a concerted effort to pull together all of the laser scan data and photogrammetric data in existence all over the globe related to Notre Dame. And while Andrew Tallon's laser scan was the most complete scan of the building, it was neither the densest. There were other scans made later where the technology had improved and therefore the scans were denser, nor was it the most recent, but it was the most complete. So it really has been seen as almost the measuring rod for the rest of the scans and the other data that's been added to this model. Therefore, though, this model is truly worth more than the sum of its parts. And this beautiful effort to pool resources really reminds me of a medieval reliquary, where precious metals and semi-precious stones would be collected from multiple sources to amplify or even represent the material remains of a holy figure. While in the analogy here, the holy figure would be the cathedral itself. In order to complete the herculean task of replicating the roof and steeple, architect Philippe Villeneuve and his team have this composite 3D model at their disposal, as well as their own elaborate, detailed, hand-drawn technical drawings. And I think that's a really important point to remember, that of course the architect, as they were embarking on this restoration project, of course they had already done studies of the building before that restoration project got underway. Ultimately, however, skilled workers will bring the project to fruition, transforming a digital and paper cathedral into a material one. Recognizing the enormity of this task, the Établissement Public has recently circulated an open call for qualified craftspeople, and respondents may even be tapped to contribute to the rebuilding effort. So this, to me, because the international architectural competition has been abandoned, I see this effort to sort of ask for help from skilled tradespeople as being a gesture to that original idea of the architectural competition. So asking for everyone to pitch in if they have the skills to do so. So there are a few questions remain about what to do with the cathedral as the conservation proceeds, as the cleanup effort proceeds, and as questions about the restoration begin to be answered. So first there's the question of the vaults, and there's no image that depicts the problem with the vaults better than this image, so I'm showing it to you again. The cathedral's damaged limestone vaults will most likely be repaired using limestone, yet again, comparable to the original stone, but it will not be the same stone that you saw the workers, for instance, pulling away and taking down and removing. So all of that it's being cataloged, it's being studied. So samples are being taken from those stones. But in some cases they've been damaged. And even if they haven't been, it's just very unlikely that they will be used in the restoration. Instead, new limestone will need to be sourced from appropriate sources. And then the new stone will be placed here again. But that said, this is certainly an approach that often happens in restoration practice in French churches, and so it's not unusual. And you'll be able to tell the difference. So especially if you're a kind of archaeologically inclined architectural historian, you'll of course be able to notice that it's 21st century stone, not 13th century. But with that said, it's really common. It's a common practice in restoration practice. So the next question, that one's pretty straightforward, fairly easy to answer, but the next question is the question of the roof. So the 13th century roof, which was made of over 1,000 freshly felled oak trees, was an integral part of the cathedral and an important example of medieval technology. But now, because of the fire, the architects are confronted with the question of how to rebuild it. Should the roof be rebuilt as it used to be, in wood, of course, in oak, or rebuilt in a less flammable material? At this point, it sounds as if the wooden roof will be rebuilt in oak. And interestingly, rather than replicating every single section of the roof, because there were changes over time, of course, it was built over time, and just like the rest of the cathedral in stone, the design of the roof also changed over time. So instead of being replicated beam for beam, it's starting to sound as if the carpenters will essentially pick the best or an ideal section of the roof and then repeat it many times over in the cathedral. Whether carpenters will use medieval techniques, modern techniques, or a combination of both remains to be seen. But interestingly, last month, during the European Cultural Heritage Days, they demonstrated both of these approaches. So some people were using hand tools and others were using mechanical tools to recreate a couple of sections of the lost medieval roof. Lastly, there is the vexing question of the spire, which was obliterated in the fire. For more than a year after the 2019 fire, what remained to be seen was whether the spire would be restored identically as it was on the day before the fire, or whether a new spire would be designed for the cathedral of the future. This question is among the most difficult to answer, and it even for a time pitted the restoration architect against the leader of the organization overseeing the project. And you may have heard about this incident because it was reported in the media. Yet the spire destroyed in 2019 is not the first one Notre Dame ever had. From the 13th century, Notre Dame had a spire, and you're seeing that one here in a 17th century etching, which gives you a sense of the scale and profile of the 13th century spire. So you see it here in this image, and we're looking, this is sort of from the southeast of the building. However, during the French Revolution of 1789, the spire was damaged, and it was later taken down and entirely removed, resulting in the view you see in this 19th century engraving, which is based on a drawing. Yet the base of the 13th century spire did survive under the roof, and you can actually see some signs of that right here at the sort of juncture between the central vessel and the transept. Lassus and Viollet-le-Duc, the two architects who restored the cathedral in the mid-19th century, studied the physical remains and graphic traces of the 13th century spire to design their own new spire. And that's shown here in one of their 1843 competition drawings. While the architects certainly used their imaginations to design this steeple, their spire closely resembled the original. And you see overall in profile, it does share a lot in common with the lost 13th century spire. However, in 1857, after Lassus's death, Viollet-le-Duc drastically revised the design of the spire. And so you see the new design here in this representation. The architect used as his model the 16th century spire of Amiens Cathedral, which you see here at right. And yes, it's true, if your eyes are not deceiving you, the Amiens spire really does lean to one side. In fact, as art historian Lynn Courtney has pointed out, Viollet-le-Duc was acutely aware of the possibility that this might happen, and he made a concerted effort to ensure that the Notre Dame spire would hold up in the event of a violent windstorm. Viollet-le-Duc also drew inspiration from the remnants of the base of the 13th century spire, which he studied before replacing. He essentially brought that interior structure, the whole apparatus, outside for the layered base, where the statues of the apostles and evangelist symbols were then placed. So the overall structure, that kind of grid that you see, that all was it's almost as if it was pulled from the interior to the exterior. As I mentioned earlier, the Prime Minister announced shortly after the fire that there would be an international architectural design competition to determine what to do about the lost spire. Numerous architects and historians, however, subsequently vocally opposed that initiative, dismissing it as a beleaguered president's vanity project. I personally saw it a bit differently, as I think it was intended as an internationalist gesture in the midst of a project that might otherwise have become strictly national. Separate from that official initiative, an architecture publication launched an unofficial design competition. The winning entry in that competition is shown here at right. It was designed by the architects Kai and Lee, two Cornell University trained women who work at the firm Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. A project along these lines, as you can well see, would have revealed rather than concealed the fact that the restored cathedral will, whether we like it or not, be a product of our own time. As it turns out, the 21st century restoration project will be far less radical than the image you see on the right. In July 2020, President Macron signed off on a plan to restore the spire identically, favoring a design more like the image at left than the one at right. By the time the one-year anniversary of the fire rolled around in 2020, officials were no longer holding fast to the 5-year timeline. And in fact, this really went kind of without saying. They just changed their tune a little bit. Now, they predict that regular worship services will resume and the cathedral will reopen by 2024. However, the restoration will most likely continue, maybe even well beyond that date. For now, the cathedral remains closed to the public. However, a sign printed on the temporary barrier installed around its perimeter reassures visitors that Notre Dame's rebirth, or renaissance in this case, is already in progress. I visited Notre Dame for the very first time during its last major overhaul in the 1990s, and I have since returned countless times, not only for research, but also in the company of family, friends, colleagues, teachers, and now more recently, students. Most recently, I visited the site in February of 2020. You've seen some of my photographs from that trip here. I was there for a meeting, oblivious to the fact that the emerging pandemic would make it my last visit this calendar year, if not longer than that. Ultimately, it took not one, but 2 disasters for me to learn not to take the Cathedral of Paris for granted. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions you have. I'll also open up the chat and see what you've asked as I've been speaking. So I look forward to hearing from you and answering your questions. So I see the first question, if I go back, I see that the first question had to do with what damage was done to the 2 west towers and the belfry.
Not to restore the spire.
And that's a good question. I'm going to okay. It's a good question. This was a really key moment, was when essentially the firefighters had to make the decision to abandon trying to save any part of the roof in order to protect the west towers. And there's a wonderful, the New York Times article that talks about this is really excellent, and it has some wonderful graphics. So that's where you can go to read more about this. There have also been interesting books written, sort of firsthand accounts from the firefighters themselves. So I'd encourage you to look for those books as well if you're interested in knowing the sort of blow by blow of the firefight, because it was very dramatic and it was very dangerous also for anyone who was involved with that. So the West Towers being preserved, that was actually something that President Macron mentioned specifically as being a real silver lining of the whole incident, was that they were able to save the towers. The real fear there was that if the belfry had caught fire, that if it was damaged like the roof, if it fell apart and was charred like the roof, the bells themselves, which were attached suspended from the belfry, the bells themselves would have become careening projectiles, and that could have caused a lot more damage, structural damage. So that was a real highlight of the night, was the fact that the firefighters saved the West Towers. The question about the stone, so far I haven't heard the exact source of the stone. There was Janet, you may know this already, but there was a presentation just last week, and so there's a working group at the CNRS that's the people that you should ask if you're interested in knowing the exact source. I'm really concerned about this. I'm sure that they will think this through, but because in the 19th century restoration, they used more porous stone, lower quality stone, because they also were planning to use this new technology called silicatization, which, water glass, applying water glass to the surface. They thought they were going to make the stone stronger than ever by applying this new fangled material. And of course, it washed off in the rain very quickly and left then this stone exposed. So that's part of what had led to the 19th century, or rather the 21st century restoration that was just getting underway in the first place, this melting stone, which was mostly from the 19th century. So I'm really interested to hear what the answer to that question is, but I don't know the answer yet. There's a question about the buttresses, basically what the cradles for the buttresses were supposed to do. And this is a very good point. You thought the buttresses did the buttressing. Well, they do, and they still are doing that. The concern there was that if the vaults fell, which there was still some sort of threat of collapse of the vaults, especially at the beginning. If the vaults had collapsed, then the flying buttresses, which generally don't push inward, this is kind of a misconception about buttresses in general, they don't usually do that when the vaults, there's a force going the other way. However, if there's no vault at all, then that was the concern, was that the buttresses were going to start acting on the walls and could have potentially led to even further structural problems. So the idea was to essentially neutralize the force of the buttresses. A question about what the original source of the limestone was. This this is actually addressed in Sandron and Tallon's book. So if you're interested in knowing the details, there's a whole chapter about this. There were a few possible sources that have been identified. And there's also a wonderful project that has started to find the provenance of limestone. So there's a particular scholar, Annie Blanc is her name, and you should look up her work to know all the details about this. But around Paris is the answer, the sort of short version of the answer. There were some quarries in the Latin Quarter. There were other quarries in nearby villages, what would have been sort of villages associated with the cathedral, and those quarries could also be exploited. A question about the donors, asking whether the donors have followed through. And I know the big question there was about the kind of billionaire donors who had pledged the most money. And the answer is yes, they did make good on their pledges. So that has been resolved. The foundations that were founded to raise money for the restoration, they still exist, and they're still very much looking for money. And I find this interesting. And of course it's a Herculean task, and I know that it's going to require so much money to be done quickly and well. But with that said, knowing what I know about all of the buildings in the world that need to be restored, proceed with caution, I suppose, is what I would say about that. Give money to what you love. That's what I have to say about that.
How do I ask a question?
You can ask it just like that. I can hear you.
Okay. Oh, may I do it now? I didn't want to interrupt.
Go for it. It's fine. I can still see the questions. The chat will still be.
What inspired the Spire? Why did they do that in view of the fact that the cathedral, to me, is far more aesthetically beautiful without that? And when did you say it was constructed first?
19th century.
But you mean the first one or the second one? So the medieval one or the 19th century
The
one?
medieval one.
So there's a Professor Robert Bork at the University of Iowa has written a book about spires in general, the idea of constructing them, and he sees them the way he describes them in terms of skyscrapers. So basically skyscrapers of the New Jerusalem. And so this idea of the heavenly Jerusalem is certainly part of what's happening there. There also would be relics and bells placed in most of these spires, so they also served a liturgical function. But I think the skyscraper metaphor is a good one because it's, why do we build skyscrapers? It has to do with marking a city. It has to do with visibility from afar. When a pilgrim approaches a city and has been, long waiting to see it, you can imagine how impressive it would be to be able to sort of find your way through the spire. So it's to be conspicuous is the.
Is there any motivation for not putting the spire back up there?
After, you mean now? There were people who thought that, certainly, and I think especially if you were concerned with the fact that, as I mentioned, the fact that the spire crashing through the crossing vault was what caused so much of the destruction, then you could make the case for it. But what has been argued, the counterpoint, is that not only was the medieval spire integral to the building, was really an integral part of the building, but so too was the 19th century spire. So specifically Viollet-le-Duc's design, for a 19th century art historian, losing that would be losing a major monument in and of itself. So especially people who study the 19th century see it as being really important to put back in place.
How do you feel about it personally?
I would say in general, I wouldn't have had a problem with rebuilding both the roof and the spire in a less flammable material. I understand the argument for doing what's being done, but I just think there are many reasons that it would be prudent to use different materials. And that's not unprecedented either. There are places that even in the 19th century were those kinds of structures would be restored using what were modern materials at the time. So things like iron and concrete, even in the 19th century, cast concrete.
Okay, do it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Will the new spire mimic the earlier spire or the spire from the 1800s? And the answer is certainly identically replacing the spire that was there as of 2019, which means the Viollet-le-Duc spire as designed in 1857. Why didn't the heat destroy the rose windows? It certainly could have. The fire was hottest up in the roof, and then once the gaping holes in the vault opened up, that's only the point where it really would have penetrated the stained glass. So I suppose it's simply lucky that they were able to put out the fire quickly enough after the fire actually made its way into the building. But this also has to do, again, with the independence of the roof from the vaults. So for a lot of this, the fire, the fire wasn't touching or getting very close to the rose windows. But there was concern about that. There were initial reports that there was micro cracking in the transept roses, so there was concern about them for sure. Golding's novel, The Spire, I don't know if maybe it's here, maybe right back here, of course, yes. And in Golding's novel, The Spire, the whole idea of this being almost a community project, there's something to that as well, and I think it's very much being pitched that way now. What's been really touching to me over the last year and a half is all of the auditoriums that have been full of people who care about this building, whether it's the public or it's the people who are every day sorting through the remains of the cathedral. And so really the way it's bringing people together is very moving to me. So we are living, I hope not in the kind of Lord of the Flies way. I know Golding's novel takes a turn, but let's emphasize the community spirit, the communal spirit of that novel for now. Lead pollution, this is what led to, so there was a wonderful New York Times sort of expose about lead pollution. And this was a major concern shortly after the fire. And it was taken more seriously, especially after that New York Times expose was published. And so now you'll see, even before COVID, everyone working on the site, they're in, I mean, it's not a hazmat suit, but it's close. And they have to take showers before or after leaving the site at the end of the day. So precautions really are being taken. And there have also already been researchers at the CNRS have already been basically de-leading fragments from the building. So this is also leading to sort of scientific treatments and conservation treatments of any fragments of wood or stone that have traces of lead on them. They're being de-leaded as part of the conservation process. What happened to the organ? The organ was a survival, but it's also now just beginning a major multi-year restoration campaign itself. So if you're interested in the organ of Notre Dame, you should look for this, because there are people interested in specifically restoring the organ. If it's a sort of philanthropic interest of yours, you might even want to support their cause. So that's just beginning right now. And again, at the European Cultural Heritage Days last month, there were representatives from that initiative speaking there to introducing the idea of the organ restoration. So it's being taken down, and each pipe from the organ is being taken down, and it will then be reinstalled. And I can't remember the end date, but it's really going to take years, just like the whole cathedral itself. So it's an impressive task that they're taking on. Question about fire suppression. I sure hope so. I've met more wonderful, fabulous fire people in the United States and elsewhere since this happened, and I think it's really important. I assume so, but I actually haven't heard details from the restoration architect about this. There's also a concern about the roof itself was a historic monument kind of in and of itself, and so that's part of why there wasn't fire suppression there in the first place. There's a question about the oak. Wasn't it seasoned? No, this was a misconception that was, and I know it was published in the media as well, so you might have read it there, but no, it was, the trees were ancient oaks, but then they were freshly felled and cut very quickly. So they don't have to dry out, none of that. This is a medieval technique, I suppose you could say.
Lindsay, thank you so much for all of this. This was just fabulous. As you can tell from all of these great questions and all of these good Wichitans and people all over who are excited about your talk. So everyone from home, give Lindsay a final cheers, and yay! And thank you so much for joining us. Be safe, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.